Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hurricane Ian has made landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast as one of the strongest hurricanes ever to hit the continental United States. The storm crashed ashore Wednesday afternoon near Naples, just shy of Category 5, with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, a 30-foot wide eye wall, and hurricane-force winds that extended 40 miles from the center. High winds and storm surges devastated coastal communities, while forecasters say torrential rains will continue to bring life-threatening flooding to much of Florida in the coming hours and days. The Lee County Sheriff says hundreds of people may have died in the storm. Ian forced the evacuation of more than 1.8 million Florida homes and knocked out power to some 2.5 million people, many of whom lack clean tap water. After Headlines will go to Florida for the latest and also speak with a climate scientist. Meanwhile, at least 20 Cuban migrants are missing and feared dead after their boat capsized off the coast of Florida Wednesday amidst heavy surf from Hurricane Ian. The Coast Guard says it rescued 3 of the asylum seekers, while 4 others managed to swim to shore on Florida's Stock Island. This comes as Cuban officials are working to restore electricity to millions of people after Hurricane Ian caused the island's entire electrical grid to collapse. In Puerto Rico, an oil tanker will begin unloading 300,000 barrels of diesel fuel to the island after the Biden administration granted a limited exemption to shipping restrictions under the century-old Jones Act. In a statement, the Department of Homeland Security said the fuel was needed to provide electricity to critical facilities as Puerto Rico recovers from Hurricane Fiona. Nearly 2 weeks after that storm collapsed the island's fragile electrical grid, about 20% of homes and businesses remain without power. There are widespread shortages of clean drinking water. Russia's announced plans to formally annex 4 regions of Ukraine seized by Russia's military after its invasion in February. The Kremlin says President Vladimir Putin will announce the annexations during a speech in Moscow Friday. This week, authorities in the 4 Russian-held regions said residents voted overwhelmingly in support of referenda on whether to become part of the Russian Federation. The votes were condemned as a sham and a violation of international law by Ukraine, the United Nations, the U.S. and its allies. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials have finished excavating a mass burial site in a forest in the town of Izium, which Ukraine recaptured in a counteroffensive this month. Kharkiv's regional governor said most of the 436 people buried at the site had their hands bound with gunshot wounds and signs of torture. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with a Ukrainian journalist just back from Izium. German officials are warning of an environmental disaster in the Baltic Sea after the Nord Stream pipelines that carry Russian gas to terminals in Europe ruptured Monday in what the U.S. and the European Union officials have called an act of sabotage. Swedish scientists say they detected 2 large underwater explosions shortly before pressure through the pipelines plummeted. One of the leaks is producing a nearly half-mile-wide pool of bubbling seawater. Officials estimate some 300,000 metric tons of methane have vented into the atmosphere from that site alone, which would put it among the worst gas leaks in history. Methane is a significant contributor to global heating. It can linger in the atmosphere for decades before breaking down, with about 80 times the warming power of carbon dioxide. Finland's government says it will severely limit passenger traffic along its border with Russia and will ban Russian citizens traveling with tourist visas from entering Finland beginning on Friday. The announcement came amidst a mass exodus of military-age men seeking to avoid conscription in the Russian military after President Putin announced plans to draft an additional 300,000 troops. In a break from its allies in Moscow, Kazakhstan on Wednesday promised to ensure the safety of an estimated 100,000 Russians who've crossed its border. Meanwhile, tens of thousands more have crossed into Armenia, Georgia, Mongolia, and other neighboring countries in recent days. Vice President Kamala Harris has wrapped up her 4-day trip to Asia with a visit to the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. Earlier today, she spoke after North Korea test-fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles, and a South Korean official said the North was preparing its first nuclear weapons test in 5 years.
The DPRK has a ballistic missile launch program, apparently, including just yesterday, and are destabilizing the peace and security of this region. Our shared goal, the United States and the Republic of Korea, is a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Camp Humphreys, south of Seoul, is the largest U.S. overseas military base and one of several American bases in South Korea that together house almost 30,000 troops and material. Last year, the Biden administration ruled out redeploying so-called tactical nuclear weapons to South Korean soil, though the U.S. military maintains a large arsenal of long-range missiles and naval-based nuclear weapons capable of devastating North Korea. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces killed 4 Palestinians and wounded more than 44 others during a Wednesday morning raid on the Jenin refugee camp. It's the latest in a series of near-daily raids that the Israeli military has been carrying out in Palestinian communities. 3 of the 4 men who were killed were members of the armed group Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, according to Al Jazeera. This is Atta Abu Ramela, a Fatah leader in Jenin.
They were deliberately assassinated by Israeli occupation forces who stood on rooftops in the upper areas of the Jenin camp and targeted anything that moved.
In Oakland, California, at least 6 adults were injured in a mass shooting Wednesday. The shooting occurred at Rudsdale Newcomer High School, which serves students who are at risk of not graduating and have recently immigrated to the United States after fleeing their home countries because of violence and instability. Oakland's Assistant Chief of Police, Darren Allison, says a suspect remains at large.
We are currently and actively looking for at least one shooter, although there may be other individuals involved. We have our ceasefire teams as well as our violent crime operations teams actively in this moment following up on leads looking to bring to justice those responsible for this heinous act.
In Illinois, wounded survivors and the families of 3 people killed in a mass shooting during a 4th of July parade in Highland Park have filed a lawsuit against gunmaker Smith & Wesson, 2 gun stores, the man who's been charged in the shootings, and his father. The lawsuit charges the gunmaker and gun sellers acted with negligence and employed deceptive practices, arguing the shooter was the type of young consumer susceptible to Smith & Wesson's deceptive and unfair marketing practices, and that the shooting was both predictable and preventable. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom signed legislation Wednesday making it easier for farm workers to cast their ballots in union elections by mail and protecting them from retaliation from their employers. In a statement, Governor Newsom said, quote, "California's farm workers are the lifeblood of our state, and they have the fundamental right to unionize and advocate for themselves in the workplace," unquote. Just last month, Newsom had threatened to veto the bill known as AB 2183, but reversed his opposition after President Joe Biden and other top Democrats spoke in favor of it. That followed a long grassroots campaign waged by thousands of farm workers and their allies who in August marched over 300 miles to California's state capital in Sacramento to demand protections for union supporters. United Farm Workers President Teresa Romero celebrated as the bill became law.
This is an incredible victory. Starting next year, farm workers can participate in elections free from intimidation and deportations. Sí se puede.
To see our interview on the organizing efforts, go to democracynow.org. Thousands of prisoners in Alabama began a labor strike this week to protest overcrowded, understaffed, and dangerous prison conditions. The strikers warn that despite a 2020 intervention by the Justice Department, conditions within Alabama prisons remain, quote, incredibly unsafe, inhumane, and exploitative. The work stoppage, which also calls for sentencing and parole reforms, began Monday after 3 months of planning by prisoners and with help from groups including Alabama Prison Advocacy and Incarcerated Families United. A warning to our audience, the following story contains graphic images. Here in New York City, never-before-seen images show people incarcerated at the notorious Rikers Island jail, locked in cage showers and sleeping next to a pile of feces. The pictures were obtained by the news outlet Gothamist after the Manhattan District Attorney's Office requested them while investigating the consequences for people held at Rikers as they await trial, sometimes for months or years. This comes as the Texas Jail Project has documented severe overcrowding at the Harris County Jail in Houston, Texas, which has surpassed Rikers with 19 custody deaths in the first 8 months of 2022, more than the total number of people who died in jail in 9 of the last 10 years. Meanwhile, a federal court judge has ordered Los Angeles County to fix its massive backup and address squalid conditions in the jail's overcrowded inmate reception center after revelations of horrific treatment, and ruled that officers are now barred from chaining anyone to a chair for more than 4 hours after some had been found to be chained for days. The Right Livelihood Awards have announced their 2022 laureates, recognizing those who show that systemic change is, quote, not only possible, but outright necessary in the face of failing governance and the breakdown of international order, unquote. This year's laureates include a mother and daughter from Somalia fighting against gender-based violence, a Ugandan organization battling oil and gas companies in order to protect the environment, and a Ukrainian group documenting war crimes and human rights violations. Alexandra Matvichuk and her Center for Civil Liberties were honored for their work promoting democracy in Ukraine in the face of Russia's invasion.
We are fighting for our freedom in all senses. For a freedom to be independent country. For a freedom to be Ukrainians with our own language and culture. And for a freedom to have a democratic choice, which means to build and to develop our country where human rights of everybody are protected.
To see our interview with the laureate, go to democracynow.org. And some longtime progressive journalist and anti-war activist William Rivers Pitt has died of a heart attack at the age of 51. For nearly 2 decades, Pitt served as managing editor and senior writer for the news site truthout.org. In 2002, he co-authored the book War on Iraq, What Team Bush Doesn't Want You to Know, with former weapons inspector Scott Ritter. William Rivers Pitt spoke out repeatedly against false claims by then-President George W. Bush that Saddam Hussein had acquired weapons of mass destruction.
Well, in the State of the Union address in 2003, Mr. Bush said that there were, 26,000 liters of anthrax, 38,000 liters of botulinum toxin, 500 tons, which is 1 million pounds, of sarin, mustard, and VX nerve agent, 30,000 munitions capable of delivering the stuff, mobile biological weapons labs, and uranium from Niger for use in nuclear bombs. By the way, the page describing all of this is still up on the White House website today. It's called Disarm Saddam Hussein. You can go find it yourself. I said, that's a pretty big lie.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.